Psychologically, the vast tradition of a people retires from a conscious subjectivity to a subconscious subjectivity. Gradually, we build over the surface of the past until this past seems to retire into obscurity and darkness. Yet, under certain pressureful circumstances, these past burst through out of its own subjective darkness and has a distinct and definite bearing upon our present way of life. Some have held that Plato, under the fable of the lost Atlantis, described the fall of man or the fall of the destruction of the golden age which preceded the present experience of mankind. It could only mean by this the fall of man from a state of spiritual luminance into a state of material obscuration. That perhaps this fall of man is therefore the descent of the human being into the material world, or the creation of a physical material dilemma in which his ancient spirituality awakened state is no longer remembered by him. As a child coming into his birth, losing many and all memories of pre-existence, so man gradually descending into materiality loses likewise all records of any previous conscious experience. This in turn leads gradually to the fall of human consciousness into the darkness of material embodiment. That the lost Atlantis, therefore, is the lost golden age, the lost better world that preceded the state we know. This brings us to a very interesting problem that has never also been well settled, and that is why history from the beginning, from all the history that we know, is always the history of the decline of peoples. Everything we pick up, even history that we read, is the history of something falling apart over great periods of time. When did Egypt rise? What history do we have of the magnificent ascendancy of Egypt? The first time Egypt comes to us, we find it already strewn with monuments to the heroic dead. Gradually, as Egypt's history unfolds, Egypt falls apart and finally disappears as a powerful nation. What do we know of the history of West Africa, the Ashanti warriors, the great Benin kingdoms, or the Yorubas and the Ife of Nigeria, who were once a powerful kingdom and whose artifacts and statues depict gods and kings? We only pick up Nigeria misgoverned and badly managed, exploited and corrupted, and gradually falling apart under a succession of selfish and inadequate rulers. What do we know of the history of the rise of China? What do we know of the great classical Chinese civilization that must have long preceded Confucius and Lao Tzu? Nothing. One dynasty after another, and in their hearts the same. Where is the great heart of China? The great heart of China is prehistoric. The great heart of China belongs to the dynasty of the Shang, and we have very little of it. This was the great classical period of somewhere 4 or 512 or 1400 BC. Then we come down a little later, and we have pretty good heart in the Han dynasty. Then we get some fairly good things, but not quite so good, in the dynasty of the Wei. These dynasties, earlier in the Christian centuries. Then comes a fine diffusion of heart, but not quite good, in the Tang dynasty. The Tang dynasty moves inevitably into the Song dynasty, and things are getting worse artistically every minute. Finally, it collapses in the Ming dynasty when heart falls apart. So today, heart of 100 years ago in China is for the most part totally uninspired, and heart of 3,000 years ago is the highest in China. The question is, Why do these things always fall apart? If we go to Greece, we have no knowledge of the true culture of Greece, except for a few fragments. These fragments we know so little about that it was perfectly possible to fabricate a whole group of Etruscan antiquities and deceive the best curators and museums of the world. Yet these ancient fabrications based upon fragments were far better than anything produced in the classical period. Babylonian culture went to sleep almost before history began. As far as we're concerned, and we know when the Spaniards reached the coast of Central America, the Indians living there had already forgotten the builders of the great monument cities of that area. All these things belong to some other time, time that was sometimes good but gradually fell apart. What is the history of Europe? Or the history of a great continent falling apart ethically, culturally, morally, and spiritually. Until today, we are truly at a very low end in all of European consideration. If we want to look for anything that is important in Europe, we must go back to the Druids, the Stonehenge, to the monuments of Karnak in Brittany. We must go back to the ancient Nordic mysteries, the city and invasions, the Phoenicians merchants. There was where Europe was. It is true that culturally, Europe was greater 500 years ago in some respects than it is today, but it was not too much even then. The great history of Europe is unknown. Back in the very dawn of things, there must have been and was great universities, great druid colleges, where men were measuring accurately the motions of the stars, while most of what we call Europe was still hopelessly in a primitive state. When were the beginning of these things? Where were the great rises of empires? Where were the magnificent foundations of culture? Who taught the Egyptians the great philosophies? We don't know. Where did Orpheus or Apollo come from? We don't know. Where did the great rites of Babylonia come from? We can only guess. What came before India? What before Persia? No one knows. Yet practically every institution that we know is born fully developed and matured, like Athena, which began growing inside the head of Zeus, who was never born an infant, but a fully grown warrior, dressed in armor and ready for war. These things do not quite fit together and make sense, but we are faced with them. And the psychological possibility seems to be that there was at the beginning of things some kind of a tremendous dynamic, that this dynamic gradually over vast period of time sank and is now utterly immersed on the surface of the dissonant culture fragments that we today call civilization. There are even traces of a world language now forgotten. There are evidences of world art now forgotten. There is a great deal of proof of world navigation. Thousands of years ago, what was it all about? How did it all happen? When did it happen? And why was all of these slowly and inevitably broken down? Until why we have a certain scientific achievement today, we have built our modern civilization not upon a magnificent monument, but upon a classic ruin. This is perhaps in some way related to the psychology of Atlantis, the psychology that somewhere there is the positive side of this thing we call culture. Whether we wish to assume that Atlantis was a place, or we wish to assume that Atlantis was a state of consciousness, perhaps, the thing we are seeking for, these rise of life, was never a physical thing at all,